All right, Eric, I have been really excited to bring our next guest here onto Strictly Business for some time. He's someone I've gotten to know pretty well over the past few years, and I got a lot of respect for his work. And he's joining us now to discuss the business of the business. He is Justin Barrasso, combat sports extraordinaire from Sports Illustrated. What's going on, Justin?
And breaking some ground here, a Red Sox fan and a Yankees fan. Though neither one were winners this year with Jordan Montgomery and Nate Eovaldi pitching so well in the World Series. But hey, thank you so much. Big fan of obviously, John, your work, and Eric. Eric, I've had the chance to cover positive stories, not so positive stories in wrestling. Eric will always put his name out there. He stands for what he believes in, and yeah, I'm grateful to be here with both of you.
Well, we're glad to have you. Always good to see you, Justin.
Thank you.
A man who has his finger on the pulse of not only the sports industry, but the wrestling industry as well.
And that's why I want to bring you in here, Justin, because I find what you do to be so interesting. You're not just covering wrestling, you're not just covering MMA, but you're covering a sector for an institution of sports journalism that I think even 10 years ago might have been unfathomable to have a beat dedicated to what you do. So before we delve into the semantics of that, can you give us some background on how you got involved with Sports Illustrated in the first place?
Yeah, of course. You know, it's funny you mentioned that, though, because I remember when did I finish grad school? A decade ago, 12 years ago. And I remember doing a couple projects in grad class about wrestling. And I remember a professor or two saying, these are fun. They could never go anywhere with them. You could never go anywhere with them, but they're fun stories or interesting stories or compelling stories. So it's been so interesting. I had a Macho Man Randy Savage story. It's actually how I first connected with your partner, John, and Eric. And Eric was I feel like it was so different in that era, but I remember reaching out to Eric. I was writing for the Boston Herald, and I thought I could grow with the Herald in terms of our wrestling coverage. Years ago, Killer Kowalski had a piece in the Weekly Herald, and I thought Saturday is such a thin newspaper. It would be a good opportunity to grow and to build the wrestling section there. They weren't interested, so I was pitching this Macho Man Randy Savage story, and I had some good Eric Bischoff stories on that too. But I sent it to a bunch of people, Fox Sports, ESPN, and the first to respond was Sports Illustrated. Andy Gray was the editor, and he's from Framingham. I grew up in north of Boston in Peabody, and he said, I don't think we knew that yet, but we had a lot in common. I learned so much from Andy. He said, I want to take a chance on this. But we didn't end up running that Savage story. I forget why. It just didn't work. The timing. So it was actually another Eric Bischoff involved story. It was a Bret Hart story on the Montreal Screwjob. And Bret had his comments. I believe Eric was in that story as well. I'd have to go back and look. But that story was it ran in November. It was a top 25 hit piece on SI.com. And we were off and running. And he said, can you do something else? So we ran another piece. Can you do something else? We ran another piece. I think Shawn Michaels was the next one. And then there were a few more after that. And then Andy pushed for a weekly Weekend Wrestling column, which we run every Wednesday now. And so it built from there. But it is interesting how so much of the landscape has changed. I remember, I think it was for the interview with Eric, tweeting Eric and saying I had a question about Randy Savage. And Eric tweeted back and he said, what's your email? I mean, it was kind of the infancy of, Twitter was so nascent, right? Where you could do this. I feel like now if someone's reaching out to you, it's like, what am I in store for next? And then Eric, not knowing me, I mean, I'm sure I introduced myself and gave my background, and I did go to journalism school. I went, undergrad. I went to journalism school for writing, and Eric gave these great Randy Savage stories about Randy. It was a great story. Now Eric can fill in the blanks here, but they were in Vegas for a Halloween Havoc, and they're in his hotel room.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard it before. And again, this is 2012, 2013, and Randy's dyeing his beard. I believe, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, also butt naked.
Yeah, I was. He had a suite in the hotel where we were at in Las Vegas, the MGM Grand, and I was in the middle of. I just started renegotiating Randy's contract, and of course, Randy had about a month left on his contract, but we were right in the middle of things, and we were asking asking Randy to do some things in the finish, and Randy being the businessman, I know pretty old school, he was a little reluctant to move forward without having some idea as to where we were going to go in the future, which I understood. So I was there ostensibly to begin negotiating with Randy, and I showed up hungover as hell because I'd been out the night before in Las Vegas till about 2 a.m, having way too much fun. And I got to Randy's room about 9 o'clock in the morning, and Randy had taken a red eye into Vegas. So he let me in, and I sat out in the bedroom area, the largest part of the suite. And Randy was in getting ready. He was dyeing his hair, and we're kind of negotiating back and forth. And of course, there's a big bucket of beer there and a bunch of food that Randy had ordered. And I'm thinking, well, I'm going to do that hair of the dog thing, and proceeded to have a couple of beers. I'm negotiating or starting the process with Randy. I had no idea what he was doing in there, and heard a knock on the door. It was room service. Randy had ordered more beer, for God's sake. And I went to go open the door, and I looked over to my right where the bathroom was, and there's Randy stark naked, dyeing his beard and dyeing his hair. And I let the room service guy in there, and he looked over at Randy and kind of looked at me and looked at Randy and looked at me, and I took care of business, and he walked out the door, and I could, oh my God, I can just, this is really before, social media, of course. I said, oh man, I can just hear the rumors now. I can hear the rumors now. Look at Randy swinging both ways. Yeah.
I'm telling you, stories like that where I love covering pro wrestling. I love watching pro wrestling. I don't know if you could cover a major sport or field like this if you didn't enjoy the product. But it's stories like that. It was the Eric one that sticks out. It was the best Randy Savage interview I've ever done was with his mother before she passed away. And I remember how protective, may he rest in peace too, Lanny was of his mom. And he said, why do you want to speak with my mother? And I said, well, I don't want to know about the Macho Man. I want to know about Randy Poffo. And he said, I don't think it's a good idea. And finally, he must have spoke with me enough times that he knew I was sincere. And I had a 45-minute, maybe 50-minute conversation with Mrs. Poffo. And it was, sort of like if you had a grandmother and you were close with her, kind of having tea with her. And it was over the phone, but we spoke for just under an hour. And she never called him the Macho Man, or she may have mentioned that wrestling thing once or twice, but she spoke about her son, Randy. So to me, as this young writer, young journalist, young reporter, the idea that, and so much has changed since there's so many other good options now too, to find wrestling writing, but to share these stories, to reveal these aspects you didn't know, I just found it so enthralling, so compelling to write. And to me, if I'm having fun writing a story, I hope the reader has fun reading it. Another quick Eric Bischoff story, it was a little bit less glamorous. It was the Mauro Ranallo, JBL. Do you remember that story? It was the bullying story backstage? Yeah. And Eric I'm in Boston. So Eric was somewhere in Rhode Island at an indie show, I think maybe an XWF or one of those. And Eric was kind of like a commissioner for the day, or, you know what I mean? He kind of oversaw the show. And before the show, you walked in, and I was there early, and I'd had my coffee, and I said, Eric, and I think you remember I never know if people remember who I am, but Eric's were polite and said, hi, Justin. And I said, I'd love to talk to you about the JBL Morrow story. And you said, well, see me after. So I was staying for the show anyways. Maybe you were testing, maybe you weren't, but I stayed for the show. And I remember after the show, Eric said something to the extent of, I didn't know if you'd stay. And I said, of course, I think your voice would be vital to the story. Multiple people had and I've always had good relationships with people in wrestling, but multiple people who some are no longer here with us, so I don't want to say their names because they couldn't defend their side of the story, but either told me to F off or hung up on me, or it was a big story when it came out. And it looked like maybe I was trying to, in their eyes, maybe I was trying to hurt the wrestling business, when really I was just trying to tell the story. Anyways, Eric said, you expressed some hesitancy about speaking with me. But you did it. I think you maybe respected the questions. And I don't remember the conversation word for word, but I said to Eric, I'm going to play this as straight as I can. I just want it out there. I think it's important to expose another part of this industry. And I remember Eric was one of the few voices that spoke with me in that piece. And afterward, I think Eric called me or messaged me or something. And he said, it wasn't because I looked good or wasn't because I looked bad, but you did what you said you would and you played it straight. And I didn't twist the words or something like that was the extent of what Eric said. So I think since then we've always had a pretty good relationship. at least from my perspective. But
and mine as well. Mine as well.
Yeah,
Hence you're with us today.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to ask you about that just
both sides of the
because
story. It's important.
because it's for me as a sports journalism junkie. I read 10 to 12 columns a day or long form features a day in sports journal. Like today, as we tape this, it's the day after the Texas Rangers won the World Series. I've read 6 features about them winning the World Series, just of storytelling about the human emotion. And what I love about your approach is you do something that not a lot of people in the pro wrestling journalism space do. You cover the news. The news is an important part of what you do, but you, and I can tell, love doing these long form human interest features about the people involved in the industry. How much is that part of your craft, and why do you place such value on that?
Well, I think too, you want to zig where they zag in terms of there's so many people out there that do so many things so well, whether it's breaking news or instant reaction. I think one thing I take a lot of pride in, at least, is crafting a story. So this past summer, for instance, I thought it was, either people were so defensive and proud of Jon Moxley for bleeding. Others were so critical. I thought, geez, it'd be great to tell a story on why Jon bleeds. I don't think we've heard Mox talk about why it's so important to him. So we called that Moxley's dissertation on blood. And it was so much fun to get into his head because, again, to me at least, and I think this goes back to being a fan and respecting so much. And I don't wrestle, and I've never wrestled, and I think it'd be hard to hit the ropes. But to have so much respect for what the women and men of pro wrestling, what they do and the sacrifices they've made to share different stories, particularly ones behind the curtain or inside the mind of those people. I think that was an interesting chance, that dissertation on blood. Even this past week, speaking with Sting, that story ran Wednesday in Wednesday's Week in Wrestling column, and to hear Sting about the 2 times in his life he cried. And once was Panama City with wrestling Ric Flair, and Ric's been open about that. He wasn't happy with the way he was presenting himself. He wore the T-shirt, the Nitro T-shirt that night. Sting wins the match, and he's raising his hand and smiling. He said on the inside he was devastated. They'd lost, or at least what they'd built was no longer going to be theirs anymore. It was WWE owned, WWF owned. So that was another chance. And then to compare that to Dynamite last week, it's Sting and Ric again on a Turner broadcast station. And he said it felt like that moment again, but we got to rewrite it. There's a happier moment. So I just think that I try to give something every week that's not out there. And to me, that's long form. I think you want to be careful because sometimes I think it can be too long, and I think it's got to be readable. I'm a reader too, John, so I'm right there with you. I can't read enough. But to me, it's like I hope the Sting piece, if I did it right, there was nothing else out there like that.
Yeah.
So I want to give people, the reader, especially myself too. I know I'm starting to go on and on, but there was one pay-per-view, I think it was SummerSlam, the one where Brock Lesnar kept suplexing John Cena.
Yeah.
I remember I so badly after wanted, and maybe Twitter was in its infancy. It was
2014. Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking I would love to read. Like, I wanted to read more. I wanted to read more about the decision to not to bury John Cena, but he never loses matches that way. And Brock Lesnar looked great. Like I would have loved instant feedback, just like you would after a baseball game or after an NBA Finals game. I want to read more. So I wanted, to me, I wanted to help fill that gap for anyone who was interested in maybe going a little bit deeper.
Eric,
what's great
from
my perspective, Justin, is, and this is harder to do with active talent, right? Because they have a character to protect and they're involved in a storyline. So it's a little more difficult to really get inside the head of and get to know the real person. But that's where the magic lies, man. That's where, even in this world that we live in now, is with regard to wrestling, and kayfabe's been dead forever. But when you get to know the person, when you get to know Sting, when you get to know Moxley, when you get to know Brett, when you get to know whoever Randy, obviously talking to his mother, it gives the audience a chance to see another dimension of the character, like you just pointed out, that you don't typically see. But I think it connects the audience to that personality in a much more concrete way. They feel like they know them. They feel like they have a relationship with them, even if they've never met them, but they know things about certain talents that they had never heard before. There's a lot of value in that, a lot of value. It's unfortunate, and I understand it, I'm not being critical, but I'd like to see more of that, even presented within the context of the individual shows, because it just makes the performers more interesting, in my opinion.
I couldn't agree more. It was a Jim Ross story, and I think it was a kind of a sad opening, but it was Jim mourning his wife, the loss of his widow, and I mean, unfair death, and unexpected and tragic. And Jim said something to me after the story where, like, geez, Justin, you know my voice better than I do, because it read just like him. And I said, well, Jim, for a lot of you in wrestling, someone like yourself, Eric, I mean, you've been in my life since what, the mid 90s? I mean, on television, watching. So I know, if I'm doing a story with Kevin Nash, for instance, I've listened to so many Kevin Nash interviews over the last 20, 25 years. It's not difficult to do, or a Brett interview, so I think you really kind of captured the ethos, Eric, of what I try to do. But hopefully there's that relationship and that trust where someone can let their guard down and not get burned. Now, that doesn't mean later on, I might not be able to break a story. I think this is an older one, but a Wrestle Kingdom story was Tanahashi and Jericho. And I remember my editor asked, well, what if I didn't get the scoop from either of them, but what if you break a contact? And I said, well, I hope there's enough trust and enough mutual respect that that's not the case, right? And it's not like that was a personal attack on a guy, but then again, business can be personal. Anyways, I think that's the key thing, having this trust and respect with a guy or with a person where they're able to share their stories. And I mean, I'm asking a lot of people too, when we speak, I'm asking you to open up your soul. One of my favorite stories, and it's one of the proudest I've ever done, is the 25-year anniversary of the NWO. And you were the first phone call I made, and you couldn't do that story now, right? Because Scott's not here. But to me, the NWO stories are always so exciting because it's the backstory. It's how do you get Hulk? Because you might call him, and he might text back and say, I'll call you in 10. Does that mean 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 days?
It usually means 10 forevers.
10 forevers, right. Scott Hall said he would not speak to me. And Scott and I had I thought, a pretty good relationship, but maybe he just wasn't in a place to speak. And I was honest. And I think I called one last time. I said, I'm not going to keep calling. But, Kevin spoke and he shared his memories. Eric spoke. Hulk spoke. Paul White, the Giant Big Show, spoke. Tony Schiavone. And I think I went through the list of people that spoke. And I said, if I would be grateful to have your voice, but if you opt not to, I mean, that's your decision. And Scott, I think it was his last interview, sadly. I'll share one more personal one since Scott came up too. Another great Scott Hall story is the Eric, it's you is it the Lamborghini in Scott?
Oh, when I picked him up at the airport?
I don't know how he fits in that.
It wasn't a Lamborghini. It was, and I mistakenly for years, I kept referring, because I had a Porsche at the time and my wife had the Jag. It was a 4-door big sedan. And around that time I had a Porsche 911 and I assumed I must've picked him up on my car, but I found out years later, like, oh no, I picked him up on my wife's car for that very reason, because he wouldn't fit in my Porsche.
People forget, because of that era, guys were so much. You hear Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels say this quite often, that they were the smaller guys back then. You look at Bret now; he's as bigger than anybody, just about. Scott was a giant back when wrestlers were giants. Scott was a big guy. I've actually never shared this story before, and I don't think I'm breaking any trust by doing it. I certainly don't intend it to be that way. But it was an interview with Shawn Michaels, and I'd requested it through WWE. I had contacts there that knew who I was and I think trusted me. And it was after Scott died. And I didn't want to reach out to Kevin. I think I texted my condolences, but I just thought it was too close. And Sean Waltman, I thought it was just too close. But Sean went way back with Scott to the 80s and the indie circuit. And I thought, well, maybe Sean would be willing to speak. So I don't know, 24 hours go by and I hear back and I get a text, Sean's willing to talk. I said, great. Obviously very sad circumstances. And we did the interview and it was emotional and Sean's in tears. And this isn't the Heartbreak Kid talking about Razor Ramon or a ladder match at WrestleMania 10. It's talking about a dear friend who just passed away and he just said goodbye to. We stopped recording and Sean says to me, and I've met Sean. I did a spot on it was a fun sports. I thought it was fun. Sports Illustrated spot on NXT the In Your House, one of the pandemic years, they all blend together. So I've had the chance to see Sean and get to know him over the years. And I think we've always had a pretty good rapport. And he said to me, shut your camera off. Shut your recorder off. He said, I will never speak to you again if you don't tell this story the right way. He said, I'm not telling you what the right way is, but this is my friend. And Sean's, breaking down, saying this. It was so emotional and so raw. And it's, to me, I wasn't covering a pro wrestling segment or match, or I was, it's an opportunity to share someone's life. And obviously I hope that story captured the brilliance of Scott's career. It's hard to say there was any career quite like it. I remember after that story, I actually got a request from a New Japan rep. I don't even know how he read the piece because it was in English. Maybe he was able to read it or it got translated, but Hiroshi Tanahashi wanted to tell me a Scott Hall story because his Scott Hall story is very similar to Sean Waltman's, except, this is in Japan and Scott wanted to make this young guy, Tanahashi, look good. Scott was just so smart and so ahead of his time and so intertwined with you, Eric, because you guys will go down in wrestling history for what you did together. But I'll always remember that moment with Sean where it wasn't. And a lot of guys in wrestling, this is a great Bubba Dudley story who said, I don't know. He said, I'm going to intimidate you. And I said, well, about some stories, if I get it wrong, or he said, that's what we do. We're pro wrestlers. We intimidate. Or Dallas Page said something similar. But the moment with Sean wasn't intimidation. It was heart to heart. Make sure you respect my friend in this eulogy piece. So that's a moment that when you talk about relationships and people letting their guard down and not taking advantage of people when they trust you, I think those are all critical components for me in terms of being able to tell the stories that I'm able to tell.
Justin, what's the appetite for wrestling content now outside of, well, including Sports Illustrated, but in mainstream? Is the appetite grown larger because of the success of it, the growth of it?
Absolutely. And you see it with ESPN, who's been connected with WWE. We still have had a hard time, or I've had a hard time. It's a battle. I'll be in, I don't know if people, I think we're all roughly in the same era. The magazine still means so much to me. I'll be in the November magazine with the Mike Tyson piece. Getting wrestling in the magazine is still a battle. And it's still something I feel obligated to fight for out of pride. I mean, I'm not covering pro wrestling because I have to. I cover pro wrestling because I want to, especially for a mainstream outlet like Sports Illustrated. We had a Roman Reigns piece after WrestleMania 35. And I was really proud that we were able to if you can get the words pro wrestling in the magazine, you're doing something right. But I think the audience is there. I always believed that if it's good enough, if it's content is king to me. If it's good, people will find it. If it's a good story, it'll get out there somehow. And I remember that early in my career when I did a piece, it was a Yankee perspective. John, I'll send it to you if you want. I liked it. It didn't get much play, but it was a Yankee perspective at Fenway. And you got these great quotes from Alex Rodriguez and Derek Jeter, who I caught at the right moment, I think. There were two foreign reporters who were asking him questions at Fenway in a scrum outside that he couldn't understand. And by the fourth or fifth time he was asked, Jeter was really annoyed. And he looked around because I was told he wouldn't answer any Fenway or Red Sox pointed questions. And I asked him the question, and I think he was just so irritated. He was looking for somebody else to speak with. He answered my question. But that story didn't do well. My point with that is, if it's good, people will find it. So that's always been my goal, right? To make compelling stories, write compelling stories, something that people would want to read. And the dirtiest secret of what I do is, I mean, look at John's podcast, right? Matt Hardy's got decades worth of compelling, engaging stories. Eric Bischoff has stories that he hasn't even shared yet that would captivate wrestling fans. I don't know if you've been open with this one, Eric. I guess the point I'm saying is, the dirtiest secret that I have is I have very compelling subjects. But Eric Bischoff going into a hotel room or checking into a hotel, didn't you check in as Vince? There's some really good story that I don't know how much you've told that one, but
no, I've told that story before. I didn't check in as Vince, but we were all in Las Vegas for what was at one time a very important television convention called NAPTE, NAPTE, National Association for Television Programming Executives or some shit. And this was back when syndication was a very important part of the television industry. It's since become less significant, but every year there was this big convention, and with this particular year was in Las Vegas. And I'd gotten in a couple days early because, well, when I was younger, I'd like to get into Vegas early for obvious reasons. And I was with Zane Breslov. Zane used to work, he was a promoter that worked for WWF back in the day. And he was now working for me in WCW. And we got along really great. He was a fun guy. Zane didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't chase women, didn't do anything, but he gambled like a motherfucker. And he just sports. He didn't do tables. He didn't play nothing. He just loved betting on sports. So we were hanging out for a while, and he said, "You know what we should do?" He said, "I know. I have some inside information. Vince is going to check into the Treasure Island Hotel and Casino." He goes, "Why don't we call reservations and tell them that we're going to cancel, that we're Vince McMahon and we're going to cancel the reservation?" So I said, "I'll do that." So we knowing that every hotel room in Las Vegas was sold out months and months and months in advance, and then Vince would have to get to Vegas and scramble to find a room. I just thought, it was a childish, juvenile, high school kind of prank, but I loved every second of it.
And I'm guessing there was some liquid courage behind that decision as well. You guys had a few.
I wasn't nervous about doing it at all. I was probably less inhibited to do it and less professional and more like an 18-year-old kid and not like a 40-something-year-old professional. But yeah, I had fun anyway.
But I think it's so much fun with that trust. Hopefully, with your subject or the people you're speaking with, you can give the reader something they don't have. So to me, that's kind of the basis or foundation of what I've tried to build, and what I try to bring to readers. Because again, wrestling is so much fun, and obviously there are areas of wrestling that are there's an underbelly and less glamorous, but there are so many parts and so many good people that deserve recognition and stories to be shared, and so many memories too. I mean, it's a Jim Ross line, but when Sting's on TV, it makes you feel young.
Yeah,
I could go back in time at my grandmother's house watching with my brother. I mean, she hasn't been alive for decades, but it brings you back in time.
Yeah.
I think there's so much special elements of wrestling that we can share too. So not that every story is a glowing look back at the history of the industry, but I think it's another element to cover as well.
Well, Justin, I know you got to get going, but I want to ask you this real quick before we let you go. What is one thing you'd like to see improve or come out of the pro wrestling journalism space in the next 5 to 10 years that you think would better the industry as we move forward?
Well, I think you can't have it both ways. When you want mainstream coverage, you've got to take the good with the bad. I think WWE's gotten better at that, certainly. I thought it was interesting, and this is more of a combat sports take, John, than just pro wrestling. I'll circle back to pro wrestling, but I wasn't in Saudi this past weekend for the Tyson Fury Francis Ngannou fight, but I was annoyed that the post match, it just felt so gimmicky that the post fight press conference was called off. To me, that reeks of, we got your money, we did what we want, we'll see you later. And whether that's a boxing thing or that was the certain promotion behind the fight, but I just didn't like the fact, again, if you want coverage, it's got to go both ways. And you can't imagine a professional sport, the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, the NFL, after a game saying, "Oh, we're not going to have our press conference." It just wouldn't happen because they're big time. It just would not occur. I don't know. I think that, I think we have a lot of talented voices covering wrestling. I think that'll only continue to grow. I think it's nice that wrestling has the mainstream options. Be nice if ESPN did more. Be nice if The Athletic got involved. I think you need more mainstream options too. But I hope that wrestling always keeps I think any wrestling fan could tell you their favorite wrestling sites. And I just think we all have our own that you go to every Monday night after Raw, Tuesday morning, or whatever it is. But I think that just a healthy industry, you need lots of options. So more mainstream options, I think, would be nice. I could rattle off names. I'm hesitant to because I don't want to leave anyone off. But I could think of a half dozen names at the top of my head who would be great wrestling correspondents for The Athletic.
Yeah. Or
the ESPN could do more AEW coverage. And I know they're tied with WWE, but what wrestling is, it's big money. I don't know. I think they're foolish or short-sighted not to see that some of these bigger groups. So And it's such a passionate fan base. The thing about wrestling is, and it's as passionate a fan base as any other sport in the world.
I've said that a million times. You know, I used to think that NASCAR had probably the most loyal fan base of all sports, because they're obsessive. They're not just fans; they're obsessive fans, or at least they were. I don't see it as much anymore because I'm not as engaged in NASCAR as I once was. But I agree with you, man. Wrestling fans are the most loyal fans in terms of television, for sure. They are so loyal. And I just wonder if sometimes, and I know you have to go, Justin, but I just wonder if the resistance by some mainstream media into covering wrestling is because there's very few of you. There's very few people like you who are great writers, who can cover sports traditionally, and can do a phenomenal job, but also understand the wrestling product. I think for most people, probably people above you on the food chain, the corporate food chain, wrestling is still that square peg in a round hole. Everybody recognizes it's very popular, but it's not really sports. It's very athletic, but it's not really sports. And that's probably the resistance. It's always been the resistance, you know, in the advertising community. It's the same thing.
And it's not pure entertainment either. So what is it? I agree. And that's why it's stories like that NWO 25 story. The amount of phone calls I got, Eric, from the office, from our editorial, from our editors, like, holy smokes, how is this story still doing so well? Well, I mean, Hulk Hogan, I think maybe Steve Austin, certainly The Rock now, and Eric, John, you could comment on this too, but who's more recognizable than Hulk? I'm sure Austin's up there. Dwayne Johnson certainly is too, but I think still, you know, from 5 to 75, 5 to 85, it's still Hulk. Kevin Nash has been given so much of his adult life to wrestling. One of the stories we did together, and maybe because Kevin trusts me, maybe because it was one of those days, but we were doing Kevin, I'm jumping around now. Every time I want to say goodbye, I start with a new hello. But Kevin was telling a story about, it was a Mattel story on a new wrestling figure line. It was a Diesel figure and Doink the Clown. And I thought, it would be neat because Kevin doesn't get the credit he deserves, in my opinion, for that run as Diesel. He wasn't Hulk. He wasn't Brett. Kevin was special. He wasn't Shawn, but Kevin was special as Diesel. And that was an interesting era in wrestling. And WWE was very cartoony, and you had WCW with this very edgy, realistic product. And it was very different. So I thought he made the most of Diesel right from the time he won the belt from Bob Backlund. And I was in the thick of it as a kid at the time. And we were talking, and I asked Kevin a question about that era. And he said, you know, Justin, what I remember most, it's burying my mother. And I thought to myself, we're doing a wrestling figure interview here. Do I cut him off? And I said, are you crazy? Why would you cut off something that's so real and raw and meaningful? And he told this story about how he didn't particularly grieve because he had another show to go. He had another show to wrestle. And it was this, to me, very endearing story of this man who really missed his mother and loved his mother, but he had a show to, I mean, think of all the kids at the next town. If they said our champion Diesel can't wrestle tonight, who cares the reason, right? Like, you have to make your next town. It's such a unique field. I can't think of many other, like, baseball players, and I love baseball. They take days off all the time. It's part of the season, and that's a long season. It's not wrestling. Like Kevin, he's mourning his mother. So I guess the point of that story is, again, relationships. But I think there's so many fun stories that we don't know about behind the scenes, and they're not all terrible stories that make you dislike people. There's a lot of really endearing stories about the people we grew up watching and cared about. And that's so neat. So I think, to me, I'm going back to answer the questions too, but more mainstream coverage. Like, I think Kevin is another example, or there's plenty of guys who are really fascinating. Dustin Runnels, what a career, right? There's so many guys Brian Danielson, there's so many guys in AEW that are just so fascinating. Becky Lynch, she's going to be on Jeopardy coming up soon. Like, I can't wait. I haven't got her yet, but like, I would love to do a story on Becky at Jeopardy. And she's on with Macaulay Culkin, who's also a wrestling fan. Like, you can't make this stuff up. So wrestling is just so fascinating. And if people don't see it, then maybe it's not for them. But man, we live in we cover such a fascinating world. So yeah,
it's fun to talk about.
It's certainly.
Thanks for joining us, brother.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Do it again.
What's going on, everyone? It's time for another edition of Strictly Business here on the Ad Free Shows and Podcast Heat Networks. I am Jon Alba, and we have a special treat ahead for you on this edition of Strictly Business. Eric Bischoff and I are going to be joined by Justin Barrasso of Sports Illustrated for a really interesting conversation about human interest storytelling and wrestling journalism. But that's for a few minutes from now. Before we do that, I got to introduce the man of the hour, Mr. Eric Bischoff, Easy E. What's going on, brother? How you doing today?
I gotta get my beauty queen wave in. Is that how you do it? There we go.
You got to cup your hand a little more. There you go.
There you go. I like it.
What's going on, man?
Oh, what's going on? Got up at 4:00 this morning, went up into the mountains, did some deer hunting, got back here just in time to do this show. That's what's going on. That's my life.
Love it. We will be airing the Justin Barrasso interview in just a few minutes, but what can people look forward to when they hear that interview, Eric?
You know, Justin's such an insightful guy, and he's been around wrestling and wrestlers for such a long time. I love his approach, and Justin goes deep into his, I guess, style of writing, which is to get to know the character beyond what everybody else talks about. And he's got some interesting examples, one being Randy Savage and some of the people that he talked to cover Randy and the amazing stories he's received as a result. And I think it's one of the reasons why Justin is one of those writers, especially because he's Sports Illustrated, he's mainstream. That can be intimidating to a lot of talent because you're afraid of the gotcha questions. You're afraid of saying something, you mean it the right way, it gets interpreted the wrong way. By the time it gets to the reader, it's all twisted up and gnarled up and not at all what you really felt or what you were meaning to say. Justin's one of the few that I've dealt with that is very sensitive to that and respects that. So he's got a lot of credibility with a lot of people that I know.
It's a great conversation. You're going to be able to check it out here on this edition of Strictly Business. Hey, it's also the beginning of the month of November, which means there's a lot of good stuff going on over on adfreeshows.com. Eric, and you and Conrad continued your look back through the Monday Night Wars this week on 83 Weeks with a watch along of Halloween Havoc 1999. One of the more infamous skits during that period of time. Well, we saw the whole Billionaire Ted stuff launched from the WWE side. Conrad had a chance to sit down recently with the man who created those skits, David Sahadi, over on Ad Free Shows. Take a listen to a clip from that.
I'll tell you the most depressing thing I worked on, which I thought was a waste of energy, but when Nitro went, head to head up Monday night, Vince was losing his talent, and he created this character called Billionaire Ted. And it was my job every week to do these Billionaire Ted vignettes. And most of them were mean and vicious and wrong. They're Vince's ideas. The ideas I had were creative and they were pretty cool, but his ideas just like mean. I'm like, why are we wasting so much energy bashing this billionaire? Why don't we just focus on our product? Negativity out there is not going to help us whatsoever. Because there might be fans that are fans of both. So why are you bashing, one company? The lowest point of my time there, when I was tasked with doing the Billionaire Ted vignettes for, it was probably just 4 months, but it seems like a year. And it was every single week, Conrad.
I didn't know Sahadi did those damn things. I'm friends with Dave. I'm going to call him up and give him some shit.
Well, it sounds like he didn't want to do them.
No,
so
I'm just kidding.
Make of that what you
will.
Well,
Ted Turner got a kick out of him.
Okay.
When they first broke, Bill Shaw, who was Bill was still my boss at the time, might have been Harvey Schiller. I don't remember. But whoever it was, I wasn't in the room, but I think it was Bill Shaw. Thought, man, we better go get this. We better show these to Ted before he finds out on his own. And they went up and showed a couple of these things to Ted. He just busted. What I was told is he just busted out laughing. He thought they were funny as hell.
There you go. Okay. Taking it lighthearted. Well, you can hear from David Sahadi and so many other key figures behind the scenes over the years, like Gary Jester, John Filippelli, Mike Weber, Mike Mansouri, and a brand new interview that just dropped with Ring of Honor's Kerry Silkin in the Insiders exclusively over at adfreeshows.com. Now, Eric, as we were recording our interview with Justin Barrasso, we got some breaking news that we got to cover here on the business of the wrestling business, Strictly Business, and that is that AEW has signed per their words in this press release, wrestling legend Ric Flair signs a multi-year deal with AEW. The Nature Boy's new Woo Energy is announced as the exclusive energy drink of AEW. From the release, AEW CEO Tony Khan today announced a multi-year deal with Hall of Famer Nature Boy Ric Flair, who surprised fans in attendance and viewers at home during last week's AEW Dynamite show in Philadelphia, marking his historic return to TBS by appearing as Khan's special gift for the icon Sting. Flair's AEW debut comes on the heels of his longtime friend Sting's impending retirement announcement, which will culminate with the Icon's final match at AEW Revolution in 2024. Over the course of their 30-year history, Flair and Sting have shared incredible rivalries, momentous matches, and a respected friendship. Here's the interesting part here. Khan also announced that Flair's Woo Energy will become the exclusive drink of AEW. During AEW show dates, select host venues will carry the clean energy drink at concession stands for fans to enjoy. In addition, the beverage will be stocked in the wrestlers' lockers rooms and will also be seen on the announcers' desks during live broadcasts. Fans watching at home can experience Woo Energy by ordering via wooenergy.com. And in a quote from both of them, I want to read the quotes from Rick and Tony Khan here. Tony says, Rick cemented his legacy as one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time long ago, and now his world-renowned persona and his amazing wrestling mind will be major assets to AEW's programming and our position globally. Most importantly, it's fitting that the final chapter of Sting's iconic career will unfold on TBS with Ric Flair by his side. Rick says, I've been in the wrestling business for over 50 years. Together with AEW and Woo Energy, I've never been more excited and I've never had more energy. When the Nature Boy promises a show, you know how it's going to go. Woo. Lots to digest there, Eric, including potentially a can of Woo Energy. But I'd like your initial thoughts before I read you a report that just came out from Sean Ross Sapp discussing more on this.
You know, I'm happy for Rick. Rick, professional wrestling is Ric Flair's life. Ric Flair left Richard Fleer behind a long time ago. And I'm happy for Rick because Rick loves the business. He loves being around the business. It's good for Rick. It's really good for Rick. The Woo Energy thing, that's obviously a great opportunity for the people who are behind Woo Energy to get it some national promotion and exposure. That's a good thing. It makes it easier for the distributors who are trying to sell that drink and getting it into the retail outlets around the country. I had a little bit of experience with that with the Hulk Hogan energy drink way back. Got it into 3,500 Walmart stores nationwide. It's hard. It's hard to penetrate the retail market, and this is a lever and a leverage point that I'm sure the sales team behind Woo Energy is going to be able to leverage and take advantage of. So it's a win for Rick personally. It's a win for the people behind Woo Energy. And let's see what it means to AEW. Time will tell.
So here's the report from Sean Ross Sapp via Fightful Select. And this is pretty interesting. Sean says the press release provided by AEW mentioned Flair's Woo Energy drink. Sources close to Flair told Fightful that the deal was very similar to that of Randy Savage's to WCW in the mid-1990s, where part of getting Flair was also procuring a deal with the energy drink that would cover a significant portion, if not all, of Ric Flair's salary in All Elite Wrestling. In the 90s, Randy Savage departed WWF for WCW and took a lucrative sponsorship deal with Slim Jim with him. Eric Bischoff had noted in the past that as part of landing the Slim Jim deal, it paid a significant portion of Randy Savage's salary within the company at the time. When asking AEW sources about the motivations of having Flair on the roster beyond what you see on the surface, merchandising was cited as a big possibility. Between video games, action figures, and general merchandise, those are seen as big openings for the usage of Flair if those are part of the deal. So pretty immediate tie-in here, Eric, to something from your past. When you hear that report from Sean, do you see any parallels there?
Well, obviously, if what Sean reported is true, and I believe it probably is, or Sean wouldn't have reported it, yeah, it's very similar to what I did with in Randy's case. By the way, just a slight correction here: the Slim Jim deal covered 100% of Randy's salary.
So all of it, got it.
It covered all of it, and did for a couple of years. So Randy was, I got Randy for free. So, and that's why it's a win. It's a win for Ric. It gets him close to a business that is his life. Really, it's in his genetic makeup, his DNA. If someone were to take some of that DNA and replicate it and clone Ric Flair or Richard Flair, it would end up being Ric Flair. And there's no denying how much Ric loves the business. So it's a win-win and potentially a win-win-win. We'll just have to wait and see how much of a win it is for the AEW product.
Can you explain how that works, where the company covers the entirety of the salary?
Sure, it's really simple. In Randy's case, based on what Slim Jim wanted in terms of product integration, we were able to afford that. When I say afford that, we were able to execute what they were hoping to get, but we put a price tag on it that was exactly the same as Randy Savage's ask. $750,000 from Slim Jim and $750,000 for Randy, and WCW got Randy Savage essentially with no impact at all on our budget.
And Slim Jim expressed happiness with the partnership?
Oh, they were thrilled because we bent over backwards. I don't remember I don't know if you remember any of those shows early on, but Randy would come out center stage and we'd be throwing Slim Jims to the audience, and we had Slim Jim turnbuckles and Slim Jim all over the place. And, throughout the show, there was Slim Jim references. It was in programming, not a commercial, because people tune out of commercials, but they can't tune out of in program. And there was a ton of in-program exposure for Slim Jim. So they were thrilled. I mean, I think we had that contract for close to 3 or 4 years, if I remember right. So it was very, very, very effective.
Bringing Ric in kind of echoes what we discussed last week here on the podcast, where you and I had that discussion about AW starting to lean a little more in on some of these well-known legends and big names, potentially with these TV deals coming up or whatever the situation may be there. I mean, on the surface level, we don't know what the creative's going to be. We know right now he's involved with Sting, but what kind of value, if any, do you believe Ric adds to AEW television?
I know what he can add. Nobody has a crystal ball and nobody knows what's in the mind of Tony Khan and his creative, or if Ric will have any influence over that. But I think, just my first gut instinct is that Ric will end up managing. He'll end up being a mouthpiece. He'll end up representing some young talent that's on its way up, that needs that credibility, that needs, as they say in the wrestling business for years now, the rub. And who better to get a rub from than a guy like Ric Flair? That's what I see. I really can't see Ric, doing much in ring other than maybe a run in or a involvement, but not necessarily matches. But more than anything, I think Ric's gift of gab and his persuasiveness on the mic will probably lend itself more than anything to what we see on camera. I don't know how much Ric will get involved behind the scenes, but that could be interesting as well. Look, Tony needs somebody. He needs somebody. Ric doesn't have a lot of television experience. He's got, decades and decades and decades of success as a wrestler. In terms of formatting and actually writing television, I don't think that's necessarily Ric's strength. But if you can tap into his mind and his experience and his understanding of psychology and help translate that into perhaps better storytelling, I think that could be very valuable.
Perhaps I'm looking a little too into it, but I read that press release and the amount of times that was mentioned. Ric Flair returns to TBS, Ric Flair on TBS, Ric Flair on TBS, Turner. That to me gives some indication that Tony Khan at least views equity with Flair as far as Warner Brothers Discovery is concerned. And if these television deals are not fully fortified yet, bringing in a guy like Ric and name recognition there feels like there could be, I know you hate this word, but some sort of synergy there. That's just the way that I read that. Do you see anything to that?
I don't like to read tea leaves. Yeah. I just don't.
I get it. I totally get it. Well, we're going to have more discussion about AEW in just a little bit here on Strictly Business, but I want to get a chance to transition to our interview here with Justin Barrasso. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this discussion as Justin breaks down pro wrestling storytelling, Sports Illustrated, and a whole lot more. Okay, we will get that in. The rating just came down, by the way.
What is it?
832. It
That's
is
not bad.
up 7%. 18 to 49 is up 14%.
That's a win.
And that's against the deciding game of the World Series, too.
That's a win.
Yeah. So we can talk about that. And then I've got Brandon's tweet here, and we can kind of get into what he said and anything else on top of that. All right, here we go. I'll throw in the Blue Chew ad and the WrestleCade ad afterwards. Really great stuff from Justin Barrasso there. Eric, anything you want to tack on the end of that?
No, it's always fun talking. Justin is so passionate, and I think it comes across. If he would have had the time, I think we would have spent 3 hours in that interview because he's just so passionate and has so many great stories. He's a great dude and a great writer.
Excellent writer. One of the things that I think makes a great storyteller, especially on the human interest side, is you kind of have to be inherently curious about the human experience and what makes us feel things and have emotions, and how do we triumph in the face of tragedy and overcome adversity. I think that's the backbone of a great storyteller. And I think Justin really encompasses those qualities, especially the curiosity. Even you just hear in that interview how fascinating he found so many of the stories that you talked about. That is a critical element to a great storyteller. And I think that can translate into the pro wrestling realm, Eric, especially as we get into this discussion here on AEW right now. There's been a lot of discourse in the past couple weeks specifically about storytelling in AEW. And the rating just came down as we record. Pro WrestleNomics, 832,000 viewers for AEW Dynamite on TBS this week. The demo was up 14%. Dynamite overall up 7% compared to last week, which was 774,000 viewers. That goes against the deciding game of the World Series, which has actually been on pace to be the lowest rated World Series of all time between the Diamondbacks and the Texas Rangers. What do you make of it?
I think it's a win. I mean, it's up from last week, and anytime you're doing better this week than you did last week, that goes into the win column. I think it's also interesting. I said last week when Ric Flair was a surprise, and I cautioned everybody not to read too much into that because Rick wasn't promoted. Nobody knew it was going to happen. It was a surprise, a legitimate surprise, which I think are invaluable in terms of subconsciously creating a must-see TV experience. If you can over time convince the audience that you're going to have these surprises that people want to see live or going to wish they would have seen live, but you can pace them out, you can do them effectively. That's one of the things that helped turn Nitro into must-see TV and an appointment viewing, as they used to call it back in the day. It hardly ever exists anymore, to be honest with you. But I think the fact that the number was up, this week's rating was up over last week, kind of is a tip of the cap to Rick. Very possibly could be. And it's all good, man. It's a win. Take a win any way you can get it.
One of the things that may have helped with the rating, hypothetically speaking here, was that there was an important announcement advertised. Now, I know that you've had some fun in the past with these announcements.
What's the saying? One step forward,
two steps back.
2 steps back with this special announcement.
Well, this was an announcement of an announcement. And it's kind of been a running bit, right? That Tony Khan has a very important announcement. Here's a important announcement. Here's a huge announcement. Whatever the adjective specifically is, changes by the week. Sometimes Tony Khan's on camera. Sometimes they're just physically announcing it, whatever it may be. And in the past, there have been some pretty big announcements that have come out of it. But also, maybe some not so big announcements. And the announcement this week, Eric, was about the upcoming pre-sale for AEW All in London next year.
When
8
next
months
year?
from now.
Like next September?
8 months from now.
Wow.
Which it's not abnormal to have a pre-sale that far in advance, especially for a show like that. But
Yeah, it is. When was the last time WrestleMania
No.
went on sale 8 months ago? 8 months in
no,
advance.
dude, concert tickets go on sale like a year in advance now for shows. Like that's not
Concert tickets,
abnormal.
yeah, okay, concert tickets, but not it's not typical business in the
Yeah,
wrestling business.
I think it's honestly with the ticketing industry, just the way it is right now. I feel like people are sharks and want to hop on that. But my point here is this an announcement that necessarily needed to be hyped and taking TV space at that? Because a lot of fans, Eric, were feeling a little let down after this one.
A little. Let me when we're done, I'll share you some of the stuff that's been on my feed, and I haven't solicited it. I said a couple weeks ago, I'm gonna try to be objective, and yes, I'll answer a question if I'm asked, but I'll try to be as constructive and as kind as I can be in some of those responses. I just don't want to constantly be bashing. And here's the truth, John. There's nothing that I can say that I haven't been saying for 2 years.
Right.
There's nothing new here. It's the same issues over and over and over and over again. I can't talk about storytelling any more than I have for the last 2 years. And by the way, 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now, probably, everybody was like, "Oh, you're so negative. Are you just pissed off that Tony wouldn't give you a job?" First of all, I wouldn't want a job with AEW. And not because it's not a good place and it's not an opportunity, and not because I don't need the money necessarily, but at this time of my life, at this stage of my life, I just don't want that situation. I don't want that burden. I don't want to have to, because to do that job well, you've got to live with it. It's 24 hours a day. You're not there in the office 24 hours a day, or you're not on location 24 hours a day, but you're thinking about it 24 hours a day. And I don't have room to be honest with you in my life. I have other things that I'm far more interested in. And I'd rather maintain the lifestyle that I have now than try to improve upon it by jumping back into the wrestling business. So it has nothing to do, for all you trolls out there, as to whether or not I was offered a job or want a job. That is not the case. My perspective on AEW has been from someone who has been there. I took over a company that wasn't a new company. That's an advantage. A new company is an advantage because you don't have any negative baggage. WCW was trash. The brand was trash when I took it over, and I rebuilt it. And I went from a $25 million a year gross revenue company that was losing $10 million a year. And within a matter of 3 years, I think, of when I actually had control of the company, we were doing over $350 million a year in revenue and spinning off close to $50 million in profit, depending on whose books you wanted to believe. So I've been there, and I've had that massive success, an unheard of amount of success, unprecedented in every way, especially in Turner and in wrestling. But then I also got to ride that horse into the mud and watch it die. So I've got a unique perspective, and that's always been my reaction to what I was seeing in AEW. Now, I've readily admitted many times that I know I come off harsh. I know I come off aggressive, is probably a good way to say it, when I'm critiquing or giving my opinion about certain things. But that's only because I hate to see opportunities wasted. And in a way, and this is going to be considered by the trolls out there, you AEW trolls, this is going to be considered to be negative, but it's not meant to be. It's just honest. And right now, Tony Khan, because it's such a unique situation, he has his own money. He's got more money than he can spend in his next 3 lifetimes. And he's a massive wrestling fan. So he has this unique opportunity to launch this company called AEW with his own money, which means he's not accountable to anybody except for the network. And I know we keep reading, oh, the network's happy. And, David's, they mention his name like they talk to him all the time. And maybe they do. I doubt it, but I could be wrong on that. David Zaslav's happy and everybody's happy, but we've seen the attendance. We know where that's going. We know where the ratings are and where they've been and where they're going. And if not that I certainly don't want this to happen. My frustration is that I'm afraid that it will. But if for whatever reason AEW isn't renewed and isn't able to find another television home, do you know how long it's going to be before another wrestling company gets a shot? I don't care if you've got $300 million you're willing to spend. Nobody's going to touch it. If AEW isn't successful as a television property, it will be decades before another wrestling company emerges as a result of AEW's failure, if it fails. Conversely, if it's successful, who knows what can happen? You may see a third company or a fourth emerge. Not that, and I don't want to discount what's going on over at the newly rebranded TNA or with Billy Corgan's NWA. But man, it's just, we'll see what happens.
Well, I'm bringing it up because I'm gonna share something that Brandon Thurston twixt out, as you like to say.
I love that, twixt out.
Earlier, because I was actually going to wait to comment on it until we recorded our podcast today, but Brandon hit on a lot of what I was feeling, and I'll piggyback on the end of it once we talk about it. But he said this: hyping a mystery announcement and revealing it's a ticket on sale date, even for AEW's biggest show, demonstrates an astonishing disconnection with what fans care about. Who could possibly take seriously the inevitable next heavily hyped, quote, major announcement? This, among other things, should raise questions as to whether Tony Khan is creating a working environment where smart people are willing to challenge him on decisions, and if so, whether he's listening. And I thought that was pretty pointed there.
Have you ever heard me say that Tony Khan isn't going to surround himself with people smarter than him because Tony Khan wants to be considered Vince McMahon or Paul Heyman or Eric Bischoff from back in the 90s? As long as Tony's driven by ego and wanting people to know that he's the guy and he's the guy that's in charge of creative amongst all of his plethora of other titles, nothing's going to change. Tony has to listen to people who are better at creative than he is. And there's a lot of people around him who would be. Most of them
exactly it. That's exactly it. He's surrounded by a lot of people who are very, very experienced in the wrestling realm, in a lot of different walks of life from the wrestling realm. So the second part of that statement there from Brandon, where he talks about creating the environment where people are afraid to challenge him, and that's him hypothesizing based on what we're seeing here, because I mean, I absolutely agree with him. I think it came off as somewhat tone deaf that you're hyping an announcement and it's something that very easily could have been just quickly mentioned by Excalibur at the commentary desk, right? Oh, hey, by the way, AW All In pre-sales starts next week or whatever it may be. Very easily. It came across as a ratings ploy to just drag people in to tune into this big announcement. But now, what kind of equity and merit do you have the next time that you have a big announcement, especially with the track record of what we've seen lately with them?
And not only that, and again, I'm going to go back to some of the stuff that I've talked about for the last couple of years. Once the audience decides they don't love you anymore and they leave, ain't coming back.
That's exactly the point I want to make. So I've said this on this podcast many times that I thought one of the strongest things that Tony Khan had going for him, especially in the first few years of AEW, was the goodwill that he built up with his fan base. His fan base knew that if they stuck with the programming and paid attention to the little crumbs that were dropped in the storytelling, that they would be rewarded for it. Or if they wanted to get a great dream match, that they would be rewarded for it. And he came across as a fan putting on this big, gigantic wrestling show, these week in, week out Dynamite extravaganzas and pay-per-views. It felt very different than what they had been preconditioned to experience with Vince McMahon specifically. When you start to lose that goodwill, people aren't going to be making excuses for you. People aren't going to be tuning in to check out those breadcrumbs. I think right now, Eric, Tony Khan, and this is from my assessment of watching and kind of taking a temperature from others within the industry, I think he's very overwhelmed by everything that he's got going on. He's got a lot. He's got the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's got Fulham. The Jaguars are making a playoff push right now. We're entering this critical part of the wrestling season with television getting to the new year. They're adding pay-per-views, the Warner Brothers Discovery discussions that are going on with television renewals. There's so much happening. He's got Ring of Honor, which, by the way, he's trying to promote a pay-per-view for and a streaming service for.
Which, by the way, was really a bad decision, in my opinion. Went on the record saying that as well.
So all these things going on. Naturally, when someone is that overwhelmed with everything happening, you're going to start losing track of the fine details that
John, I'm gonna throw a flag on that. First of all, I don't know what Tony Khan's involvement with the Jaguars really is, other than going to the games. I doubt he's on the coaching staff. I don't know. I don't know. Literally don't know. So I shouldn't say too much. But I question how much Tony Khan has to do with the Jaguars on a day-to-day basis, or Fulham for that matter. I've been saying over a year ago, 2 years ago now, I said on 83 Weeks, in response to something really stupid and ignorant that Tony said, ignorant in the literal sense of the word, lack of information and knowledge, not to me derisive, just that's the definition of the word ignorant. And I used it in that context. I said, Tony, shut up and wrestle. Quit trying to compare yourself to WWE. Quit shitting on WWE because you're just not even close to being in the same conversation from the scope of business perspective. But he kept doing it. He continues to do it. And that's where you lose goodwill. Because, first of all, Tony, AEW doesn't have, if they have their own audience, it is a minor portion of that 842,000 people that watched the show last night, or whatever the number was. Tony's audience is also watching WWE and probably enjoy it. There may be a small percentage of Tony's audience, maybe 20 or 30%, that watch AEW exclusively. There has not been and you and I have disagreed, you see story where frankly I don't. Nothing's changed. Tony's been doing the same thing for
the
last
I disagree.
3 years.
I think it's regressed significantly. I think, and this is what I was going to say, me talking about the things that Tony Khan's got going on, that's not an excuse for any of this. What I'm saying is something is happening here where it's now affecting the quality of the product in that
I think what's happening, John, I think what's happening is people are just tired of it. They've been watching it and they've been because of the goodwill, and you're right to point that out. I absolutely agree with you. You're right on the money. But that only lasts so long.
Yeah.
And people will overlook mistakes. People will set aside their belief about the quality of a storyline or whether one actually even exists. They'll give you some time. But after a while, it's just like they quit cutting you slack.
Well,
and
I'll give you an example. Like, I'm not trying to cut you off. I apologize, but I'll give you an example here. Willow Nightingale, who is someone that I think a lot of wrestling fans look at as someone who could potentially lead a division one day, really talented, exudes charisma, the type of person you want on your roster. She has lost time after time after time in big matches. She lost multiple number one contenders matches for the AEW Women's Championship. And then out of nowhere, it's announced on social media, she's got an AEW Women's Championship match with Hikaru Shida this week on Dynamite after she just lost the number one contenders match.
And weren't they when the company first started? Weren't they supposed to keep track of wins and losses?
Well, they had rankings for a while, and those went out the window. They had rankings, and they went out the window. But my point here is rewarding fans for paying attention, right? Like, that's the beautiful part of storytelling, when you reward someone who's been invested since the beginning of the story or got involved in the middle of the story, and they're along for the ride, and you give them a payoff. If people are invested in Willow Nightingale's story, where she keeps falling short, and hasn't been able to win the number one contenders match or the big match, whatever it may be, and now all of a sudden she's granted a match out of nowhere, it reflects what I consider to be, and this is my opinion, I consider to be a very bad era of the Vince McMahon era of storytelling, the 2018, 2019, where stuff was completely disregarded. Oh, what you saw happen 2 weeks ago doesn't matter anymore. And that to me is like a huge red flag when your storytelling and your program starts to venture into that territory of disregarding things that you have established on your own television show within canon. And I know how detail oriented this guy is, Tony Khan. He's extremely detail oriented. So
It's not reflected.
surprises-
It's certainly not reflected in his show.
So no, I'm saying as a human being, he's extremely analytical and so forth. So it surprises me to see how sudden, as someone who is watching both WWE and AEW every single week, every single television show they're doing, it really was quite a red flag to me. And I think Tony Khan is a good guy who has the best intentions for his talent and his roster and the fans, but something is happening here where something has to be done. And I think what Brandon said is dead on the money.
And what's interesting is Brandon is friends and friendly and worked with Chris Harrington, who's an
Yeah.
executive in AEW. And for Brandon to come out and discuss his opinion the way that he did, as subtle as it was, it wasn't so subtle, but it was polite. It was professional, but it spoke loudly to me. If Brandon is coming out and being that critical, given his relationship with Chris Harrington and Harrington's relationship with AEW, it's not good.
And
It's
look,
not good.
I'm not sitting here saying the sky is falling, anything like that, but it's very evident
It's
that
slipping.
some sort of evaluation of what do we do to ensure there's more cohesiveness within the fibers of the product should
I think
be
it's beyond
done.
that, John. It's I mean that it's that too. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. Again, for over 2 years, I've been harping on story, and I mean a disciplined, well-crafted story with plot twists and an arc that's really disciplined and designed to have a maximum impact when it concludes. None of that is happening, and it's never happened ever since AEW's been around. It needs to happen. They need a much more sophisticated storytelling team that first of all, understand what that even means and how to do it. The other thing that I think AEW needs as much as that is vision. What is AEW? Are you going to tell me it's an alternative? In what way is it an alternative? It's not. It's just another version of, with many of the same talents that were former WWE talents at the top of the card. There's nothing different, better than, less than, different than. I came up with that one day, years ago, when I was sitting in my office with a figurative gun to my head, 20 minutes after Ted Turner told me to go head to head with WWE in prime time. What the fuck am I going to do? I didn't anticipate that. And after hours of sitting there looking at a blank piece of paper by myself, said, well, I can't be better than the WWE. I don't want to be less than WWE. I only got one other option. That's be different. AEW is not different than, unless you consider a lesser version of different. There's no vision there. So without a vision and without good storytelling, what have you got? You got cosplay.
Yeah. Again, I'm never going to take personal shots at people, especially people that I do like as human beings. And I do like Tony Khan as a human being. But it's very evident that something needs to be reevaluated here when this stuff is constantly coming out every single week. And you have a hyped announcement. The next time, Eric, that they hype an announcement, who could possibly care? Who could possibly care? It's just...
Yeah, that's, you can only burn the audience so many times before. Let's be honest. I'll be honest with myself here. people are going, people are going to fill my timeline with things they think I want to hear based on their perception of how I feel. They don't really know how I feel. They don't really know that I want AEW to be really successful, because I'd love to see another wrestling company emerge, or I'd love to see one of the ones like NWA or TNA. Got to remind myself, I'd love to see them get the next big opportunity and not languish in obscurity on the CW network or wherever the fuck TNA is. I don't even know, Access or whatever.
Access,
which nobody watches. Could be the best show in the world and nobody's going to watch it. I'd love to see them get that next big opportunity. But unless AEW shows some signs of growth, as I've been discussing for the last 2 years, unless they show some indications of growth and turn the tide, because the tide is going out and it's not coming back in. It's just constantly going out. Numbers are deteriorating. Live events are deteriorating. Everything is deteriorating. And unless they can turn that around within the next couple months, not a great deal, not like you have to do 180 degrees, but God, give us some indication other than a one-off event in the UK, because that's not really a barometer or a bellwether by any stretch. It's a one-off unique situation. But unless they can show some growth, it's going to be really difficult for anybody else to grow. And that's the part, that's the blowing the opportunity that probably frustrates me more than anything. Because it's not that hard. I mean, it's hard work, but it's not that hard.
I think focus is what it all boils down to. Just having focus and not letting all the periphery noise dictate your path, and we'll see.
And an ego check. Let somebody who's better at doing what you wish you were good at, let somebody else who's really good at it do it, and you go do the other shit.
Is that one of the toughest things as a leader, Eric, when you realize that somebody else might be able to offer
Depends
something?
On a leader. Some of the greatest leaders in the world are people that recognize their own weaknesses and fill those voids with people that are better than they are at what they wish they were good at. That's a leader. That's a leader. Someone who fails to recognize what they're not good at, but continues to do it anyway. Damn the torpedoes. That's not a leader. That's an ego.
Well, we got a lot of ego here on Strictly Business, and we want you to be part of it. Head on over to advertisewitheric.com, and you can get your business and product out in front of what I believe, and I know, is one of the best wrestling podcasts in the world right now on the 83 Weeks feed. Advertisewitheric.com is going to get your business and product out in front of thousands of listeners every single week here, and it's going to be a lot of fun, Eric. We are approaching WrestleCade, as I talked about earlier. I'm going to head on down to Winston-Salem with you. We'll have a good time there.
Oh, by the way, I'm going to bring a bunch of my new book, The Grateful. Well, that's not really a new book, but I'm going to be bringing a bunch of those with me. So if you haven't gotten your copy yet, you'll be able to get an autographed copy at WrestleCade.
Fantastic. Love to hear that. Anything else you want to throw out there, my friend?
No, I'm hungry. Kind of want to eat some lunch.
All right. I love to hear it. This has been Strictly Business. We'll see you next time. This episode of Strictly Business is presented to you by Blue Chew. Let's talk about sex, gentlemen. Remember the days when you were always ready to go? Well, now you can increase your performance to get that extra confidence in bed. Listen up. It's BlueChew.com. Blue Chew is a unique online service that delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra, but in chewable tablets and at a fraction of the cost. You can take them anytime, day or night, so you can plan ahead or be ready whenever an opportunity arises. The process is simple. Sign up at BlueChew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you're approved, you're going to receive prescriptions within days. The best part, it's all done online, so no visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, no waiting in line at the pharmacy, and the tablets are made in the United States, prepared and shipped directly to your door in a discreet package. You know, when a guy like Eric Bischoff likes to take the road, he loves bringing Mrs. B along with him, and some of those travel days can be long and arduous, so wouldn't you want a little extra something once you arrive to the hotel room? That's why Eric Bischoff keeps Blue Chew in his bag wherever he goes, and we want to help you have better sex now. Discover your options at BlueChew.com. Chew it and do it. And we got a special deal for our listeners. Try Blue Chew free when you use our promo code WrestleBiz at checkout. Just pay $5 shipping. That's BlueChew.com, promo code WrestleBiz to receive your first month absolutely free. Visit BlueChew.com for more details and important safety information. And we thank Blue Chew for sponsoring the podcast. I am so freaking excited because we are just a few weeks away from WrestleCade. It's a 3-day family-friendly convention going down in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and so many of your favorite wrestling legends are going to be there. Eric Bischoff, Bryan Danielson, the Hardy Boys, Matt Cardona, Arn Anderson, and so many more of your ad-free shows and podcast heat favorites will be in attendance. I'm going to be there as well, and I'm going to be doing a live show with Matt Hardy as we bring the extreme life of Matt Hardy live to the stage to discuss becoming broken, how Matt Hardy became the broken Matt character. It's going to be the first time ever that we're hitting the stage with that. That's going to be at 8:30 on Friday, November 24th. Eric Bischoff's going to be there signing, representing the ad-free shows team. It is going to be a convention you do not want to miss out on right after Thanksgiving. Head on over to WrestleCade.com right now to pick up your tickets.